Yesterday, I ran into somebody at Tosh Lake who paid me a wonderful compliment. They said, "I liked your sermon yesterday, okay. Wasn't my favorite. My favorite was actually maybe a couple of years ago, and it was on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, I think, which I was thinking at the time, that was a good sermon. I wish, it was on a day where more people were here." And I said, "Don't worry, I'll give it again." Most rabbis only have about 3 or 4 sermons, and they just sort of mad-lib the variations. But today I want to teach a little something different, and yet I hope somewhat timeless. The need is certainly timeless, and I want to begin with a teaching from Pirkei Avot. In Pirkei Avot chapter 5, it says that every dispute, every machloket, every argument that is for the sake of heaven will, in the end, endure. It's an argument that we will continue to have, but also remember with honor. But an argument that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. Which is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? They ask, what's an example? Such a controversy was that of Hillel and Shammai, these 2 great sages who agreed on almost nothing, and yet were both our teachers. And which is the controversy that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and his congregation, his rebel band. To clarify what is meant by a controversy for the sake of heaven, the honor goes to Hillel and Shammai because they weren't fighting with each other. They each had different ideas about how to most honor God. They didn't argue whether Torah. They argued what was the right way to follow Torah. They were arguing for something greater than themselves. And that is what made their conversation enduring. And it says even further in Mishnah Yevamot, chapter 1, although the students of Hillel and the students of Shammai vociferously disagreed about what kinds of people could marry each other, that did not stop their children from intermarrying. They'd still go to the wedding. Furthermore, even though they disagreed about what made certain ritual objects, knives for cutting the challah, kiddush cups, things like that, they disagreed about what rendered those objects pure or ritually impure, what made dishes kosher or treif, yet they still went to shul together and handled the same cup. And they frequently ate off each other's dishes, even at the wedding. Korach, on the other hand, made the case that being in charge, just for a little background, this was the person who, when Moses was leading us through the wilderness, said, "Hey, who made you boss? I'm in the same family. Don't I have the same rights to be in charge?" And if you don't know how that turned out, Moses had exemplary humility. Moses didn't say, whatever, I'm rubber and you're glue. He didn't say, you're wrong. He said, you know what? Let's let God decide. And so when they presented their cases before the Holy One, the earth opened up and swallowed Korach, his whole family, and everybody who was with them. The earth swallowed them alive, because Korach was fighting for himself, was fighting for his point of view, and not for the sake of heaven. He wanted to be right more than he valued being together. I don't believe that our sages here are telling us to never argue. God forbid, if there weren't arguments, the Mishnah would be about 3 pages long, and it's not. It's like this. But they're teaching us that arguing for the sake of something greater than yourself is durable. Just as community is durable if you value being together more than you value being right. In that spirit, I want to talk about something that often raises controversy, because I think we need to talk about Israel today and more in general. One of my mentors once counseled me that certain topics belong in dialogue, and the bima is necessarily monologue. But this is important. So if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to take a risk here, and I'm going to give you my take in general and on something specific. That's the monologue, but I invite you to dialogue. And if you'll stick around for the whole sermon, I'll tell you exactly how I think we should do that in the days, in the weeks, in the months, and God willing, the years to come together. Also, I want to put what I'm going to say in context. I need to tell you about my personal connection to Israel. And many of my students have heard this story already, so indulge me. Maybe I'll embellish it a little bit for your sake. But I need to tell you where my heart lives, and that's in Yerushalayim. The first time I went to Israel was as a rabbinical student. In fact, there was one guy who tried to talk me out of going to rabbinical school until after I'd been to Israel, because I wouldn't have the proper context. But I went into rabbinical school anyway, and about halfway through, I got to live in Israel for a good bit. And when I got there, I took the cheap flight on Turkish. Don't hate me. I got there at like 3 or 4 in the morning, and went to my flat, and then after I'd slept for about an hour, my flatmates took me out to just get some falafel and tomatoes and stuff. And then they said, "Hey, you want to go to the old city?" And I could barely keep my eyes open at this point, but I said, "How could I say no?" So we made our way into the old city and kept going and made our way to the Kotel. Keep in mind, I've been off the plane for like 6 hours at this point. And we get to the Kotel, and this is going to take a minute. We get to the Kotel, and I put my hand on the limestone in a cool place. I just started bawling. It was like when my son got married, I kept it together all the way till like the first dance, and then I just let go and ugly cried. And that was the closest experience I had to how I felt when I touched the Kotel for the first time. It felt electric, and I never felt anything like it before. I want to back up a little bit. I don't know if you've ever heard the term imposter syndrome. Many people talk about this when they're starting a new job, or they're taking a risk with their career, or something like that. They feel like, I don't know if I really feel like I belong here. And I'm terrified that people are going to figure that out about me. I came to Judaism and Jewish practice, to the Jewish community, later in life. And so I had a little bit of that imposter syndrome when I decided to become a rabbi. All the more so going to Israel. I'm above average height in Israel. I went to. They said, "Oh, don't take any clothes with you. Go to the stores there. The clothes are super cheap." And so I went. And I was like, "Hey, you can get like 10 shirts for $1." Nothing fit me. I stick out. And so I thought, all the more so in Israel, I'm going to feel like an imposter. And then I touched the Kotel, and I thought, you know what? Jet lag. It's been a long couple of days. And that probably happens to just about everybody, even the tourists wearing like the paper kippot when you get there. The third time I touched the Kotel and the exact same thing happened, I also felt this coolness sweep through my body. And every trace of that question about whether I belong at the Kotel in Israel among the Jewish people vanished. And I haven't seen it since. Fast forward a couple of years ago, when I was at a different temple, we took a tour to see the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Science Center. And at the end of the exhibit, it was really cool seeing all that old stuff. It's really cool to see the tefillin that women wore, apparently in like the 2nd century, that they still have there. I get to the end, I'm on my way to the gift shop, and there's a stone there. And there's a screen that has a live feed of the Kotel, and it's pitch black at night, but there's still a few people in the plaza. But the stone had fallen off the wall, as sometimes it happens, and they brought it to the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit. And I'm pretty sure there was a sign that said, "Don't touch this." But I couldn't resist. And it felt just like the first time. And that is why my heart lives a double life. It's here in Pasadena. It's with my kids wherever they are, all over the world now, and in Yerushalayim. So I wanted to give you that context when I say Hamas won this summer. We survived. We prevailed. But Hamas won. Because as their PR guy said on the radio over and over again, they achieved their goal. At the price of thousands of lives of primarily their own people. Or maybe because of it. They achieved their goal of further turning the world against Israel and further turning the world against Jews. That was their stated objective. And they got it. Further, they succeeded in one other thing. And I don't know if this was the plan, but it was certainly the gravy. They succeeded in further turning us against each other. And it was in the water. I mean, with the nature of polarization today, we were ripe for it. And they turned Jews against Jews. They turned rabbis against rabbis and children against parents. They won. And I just want to say shame on them. Shame on them for killing primarily their own people to get to us. And shame on us for taking the bait in a way that will, I believe, get more of our people killed in Israel and in America and around the world. There is a novel that was written early in the last century by Theodor Herzl called Alt Neuland. And Alt Neuland it's fun to read. Sometimes I like watching science fiction movies from the 50s when they talk about, in the year 1985, when we're living in space and have flying cars and eat vitamin pills for breakfast. And Alt Neuland was a little bit like that, in the sense that this was before Israel was a state. He envisioned a future with a Jewish homeland that was a technological marvel and a social utopia. Israel, left to its own devices, had figured out things that nobody else had figured out, both in greening the desert, in feeding the world, in cooperating with one another. And I mean everyone in the region cooperating. It was a beautiful, beautiful fantasy. Now, Israel is a technological wonder. As a state, it is a miracle. Not a perfect one because it's democratic, but that too is a miracle. But what struck me most is the world that Herzl described before Israel. Not a fantasy of the future, but the world that he lived in early 20th century, late 19th century Europe. This was post-Enlightenment, where we had this dream of finally being a part of the fabric of society. And Jews could live where they wanted to live. They could work where they wanted to work. They could study where they wanted to study in a way that we'd never been able to before. But it was a sham, because Jews went to law schools that they couldn't go to before. We went to medical schools. We tried to become professionals. We still couldn't break into society. The world was still largely against us. Yes, Herzl made his bones writing about the Dreyfus Affair for his local newspaper. And he saw that as far as we'd come, there were places, well, every place, we were still not fully welcome. And among his cohort, the leading cause of death was suicide because of people's despair for the world that they lived in. And that's the dark night where he dreamed his dream of our miracle in Canaan. And whatever you think about where the state of Israel is at today, I dare say, I want you to imagine a world without it. I think that world could look very much like Herzl's Austria. Because when, not if or as, when tides rise against us and we have no other beacon to look to, we're back into the dark ages of the last millennium, where we were kicked out of every single country that was ever a country. That's the world without Israel. A world where the ground is fertile, where the anti-Semitism that pops its head up like weeds today grows like an intentional crop. That's why it's important that wherever we're coming from, we be able to talk about Israel. Like I said, I've given you my take because you deserve it and because I trust you. But that's only to start the conversation that I hope will start right away and endure as the talks of Hillel and Shammai. And here's how. We're doing a number of things here at PJTC right now to get this conversation started. And I know we're not starting this conversation at PJTC. It's been going for a while. But there are some things that I'd like to do and some things that are already in the works that I want to make sure you know about. I know that after the events of this summer, the Social Justice Committee convened a meeting where people could get together and dialogue about their reactions in the moment and also their dreams long term. And I know that they've been talking to a wonderful group called Resetting the Table, which facilitates conversations in community about difficult topics. More on that in a minute. I know that here in October, I believe the 10th maybe, October 10th, thank you, Judy, the Adult Ed Committee here is hosting Rabbi John Rossov for a bagel breakfast right here at PJTC, where he's going to answer the question, why does Israel matter? Later in December, we are having representatives from Resetting the Table here for a bigger community conversation. This is something that Rabbi Amy Gerasi and I have been working on, and with the help of the Greater LA Jewish Federation, they're actually sponsoring Resetting the Table to come here and do what you might call train the trainer in a way, not just to have a conversation about one topic, but to actually convene clergy, staff, lay leaders, and anybody who wants to participate in a workshop on how to have more productive conversations about difficult topics in community. I believe that we need to restart the Israel Committee here or something similar. And I don't know exactly what happened. It was before my time. But what I hope we can do is not let it degenerate into a proxy war for American politics. in the little bit longer term, but hopefully not in the too distant future, I'd like to renew a PJTC tradition that I believe Debbie Singer was instrumental to, of having regular family trips to Israel. Maybe not every year, but every few years, so that every family and families of all ages and descriptions, and anybody else who wants to join in, every family gets to go with us to Israel, so that every family, if, touching the stone isn't their thing like it is mine, they will at least have that touchstone experience, which I think is vital to understanding and to connecting to Israel. When I say we need to talk about Israel, I mean it. Because if all we do is go to our corners, we abandon our shared responsibility, and Israel suffers, and so do we. I'm not asking you to set aside your convictions. I'm not asking you to be soft. I'm asking you to do something hard. Instead of group forwarding invective that confirms your opinions or op-eds written in spite, I'm begging you to sit down with members of your family and members of your greater Jewish family and your neighbors who aren't Jewish, and share from the heart what Israel means to you personally, as I have done here today. And when others share their heart, I'm daring you to listen. Really listen. For my part, I'm committed to setting the table here for those conversations to happen in our community, but only insofar as the participants are committed to being in community. I'm asking this of you, and I'm committing this to you because I believe deep down that the future of Israel and the future of American Jews depends on it. For Israel to endure, we need to have conversations, even arguments that endure, while our children still marry each other and we're still able to eat at each other's table. The emergence of the state of Israel in the last century has been a miracle from heaven in our time. The next century is in our hands. Let's be ready. Aleinu and Am Yisrael Chai.